thinking about something that I always think about. That's okay, who the top five are. And the top five isn't really fair. I think it's kind of the top seven, top eight. Some years it could be eight. Some years maybe it could be six. And that list is probably even shorter when we think about the guys that truly show up to your team. And now you're a completely different team. Like you're actually a title contender. And again, nobody does it by themselves. And I've said these things before. But that's why I think every year with the draft, when you're like, okay, well, what can this guy be? Can he be a one on a good basketball team? And I'm not saying LeBron, the number one on a team that's a perennial contender for a decade, which is what you get when you got LeBron. It's just somebody who can change the course of your franchise. And if we have 60 draft picks every year and 14 lottery, to suggest that we get two of those every year in the draft isn't really the case. Although this exercise, it was a little bit more, I don't know if the exercise, the way I did it, was more forgiving, or maybe there's a little bit more depth there to the question that I'm going to ask. And that is very simple, because here's the parallel. If you look at NFL quarterbacks going back, the last couple years, it was very clear there's going to be a changing of the guard. Right, Breeze was on his way out. There's some years there where like the numbers are pretty good, and then it took me a little while to go, you know what? It's actually, he kind of limits what you can do as an offense, despite a Hall of Fame career. Roethlisberger, we saw the decline, and at the very end, it was brutal. Couldn't see it anymore. We thought Brady was going to move on, so there was a group of 3 to 4. You can put Rivers in there. I think Ryan was always in kind of that 7 to 12 range. Certainly not in that top 5 range at any point, despite an MVP season. I just feel like it was clear there was going to be a changing of the guard, and that's now Mahomes, it's Allen, it's Herbert, who everybody loves from a physical standpoint. I thought Lamar's first month was incredible this year. Last game wasn't great. Who cares? Not a big deal. But the names that we were used to for almost a decade, it was going to start changing out rapidly. And when I look at the top 7 to 8 NBA players currently, and I'm going to give you those, knowing that going into the season, this is probably going to change. But I don't like changing this. Like power rankings for players, it's not really what I'm interested in doing every single week. I think it takes a while for me to think you deserve to be considered that. And then I also think it takes a little while for you to be removed from it. And it's not necessarily just one bad season or one bad injury season. Now, multiple injury seasons is a different story. So if I look at it in no particular order, I'd go Giannis, Durant, Luka, Jokic, Embiid, Steph. And I still feel like it's worth putting LeBron 7. That may be a reach at this point. We'll see what this season's going to look like as he turns 38. The stats are still incredible. He knows how to impact a game at an age that it usually just doesn't happen. You look at the rest of his draft class, like the fact that Melo's even kind of hanging on, hoping for an invite somewhere is pretty amazing. But the rest of the guys are all done. And we're talking about LeBron, and that's, again, a credit to how special he is as a player. But that feels like the right group. If we were doing tiers, and that's why I don't always love top 5, because it's like, well, what if I think 5, 6, and 7 are all kind of the same? I don't really want to have to decide as if one isn't worthy of being in that group. Giannis, still a lock moving forward. Luka, lock moving forward. Jokic, I think Embiid, the same deal. But KD, 34, another injury season. LeBron, we're getting near the end. Steph, I think, is always going to be really valuable just because the shooting is going to hold up. I just wonder if 2-3 years from now, so kind of the exercise is, all right, of the players that we're talking about now, how many names can we come up with on a list that could be potential replacements 2 to 3 years from now as like that new group of the tier ones, the top 7 or 8 players? And other players that have been on here, like Kawhi's out of this group, just too many injuries at this point, despite at one point me even wondering if he was the best single player in the NBA. Harden, statistically, was always kind of in that top 5 group. Didn't feel that he was a top 5 guy necessarily, but still worth talking about, like in the conversation. He's bumped out of that. If you look at ESPN.com, they actually moved Durant to 8th behind Tatum 7th. Maybe. I'm not sure if I feel that. The rest of the .com is Ja 9th, and Devin Booker was 10th. So that's just to kind of round out some of the other thoughts and some of the other names. So what I did is I went through all the drafts from 21 all the way down to 12 to kind of give you perspective of who could be up next, come up with the who's next list, but then whittle that down and kind of, let's come up with a defining line of where, okay, now we're going too far with it. Cade, it's too early. I actually think Anthony Edwards has a chance to be one of these guys. And that is pretty rare of me to go, yep, 2 years in, I think he could be this special, which also means you better start winning like 55 games. You need to be the number one. It's not always going to be 55 games. You get the point. Like, like what Luka did, even if I don't think of the Mavs as a perennial Western Conference Finals team, which has more to do with, well, it's a combination of things. It's the Mavs roster, and it's also how tough the West is going to be, although that can change. We'll see what happens here as we move forward. But that Luka had a run in his third year after putting up absurd playoff numbers in the first place, those couple series against the Clippers to get things started. So he's had his kind of coming out playoff run, beating a Phoenix team that was incredible in the regular season. I don't really think they had much of a chance against Golden State, but Luka has had that breakout moment, at least, where like, okay, this guy actually could carry a team this far by himself, because the rest, when you think about his number twos and some of the other guys' number twos, but a lot of that has to do also on the style of play that the Mavs have to have with a guy like Luka. So Edwards, I would put on the potential list. Keep track of this. Zion and Ja are real candidates. I mean, hell, like I said, Ja's 9th already on ESPN.com. So if in 2 years, I mean, just to remind you what Ja did this past season, 27 points, 6 boards, 7 assists, 49 and 34% from three. Those are his shooting splits. He shot 40% for three after the All-Star break. He had 47 in game 2 against Golden State, where you're like, okay, this is real. So I do think Ja belongs on the list. I think Zion probably checks a lot of different boxes on what we would expect one of the breakout players, the tier 1 players to be in the NBA. He's got to be healthier first, but to be on the potential list, no problem. Luka's already there. I don't think Trey would ever be that guy. That's probably not super surprising to a lot of you who've listened to me on these podcasts for years. He's really good, and he's very productive. I don't think he's ever going to be somebody you're like, he's one of the 7 best players in the NBA. And again, that's not an insult. It's kind of back to like the Lamar stuff with the QB tiers that we did with Sandow. If people freak out about the Lamar thing, you're like, all right, so the NFL thinks he's like the 6th or 7th best quarterback in the league with some really good ones ahead of him. All right, that's not really that insulting. To say Trey's not one of the 7 best players, or I don't think he will be in 2 years, that's not really that insulting. Okay, next list, Tatum and Mitchell. That Tatum's even being discussed as one of them, and as we saw with ESPN.com, they've already put him there. NBA Finals, some Western Conference Finals where I actually didn't think the teams were all that great. And if they had gotten out of Eastern Conference Finals, had they gotten out of the East, I would have thought it was kind of surprising. He's certainly on the list, if not already there. Donovan Mitchell, I think, is still a potential guy, but probably not. Probably not. Like, as his career has arced and it's coming off a little bit more disappointment than some of the stuff we've seen before, it still would feel like a reach to go Donovan Mitchell is going to be the 7th best player in the NBA in 2024. So I'll put him down on the list. Don't feel it. Lauri Markkanen, seen it argued somewhere. We're going to go ahead and cross that one off. Brandon Ingram, nice player, big step up, nice playoff numbers. I don't see it. Pascal Siakam, what I just said about Ingram. You could say, well, he's got the ring and everything. Yeah, sort of. Jamal Murray, nice player. Don't see it. Ben Simmons, really expensive role player. That's a no. Booker Towns from the 15 class. Booker, as we saw on .com, is 10th. When they made their finals run 2 years ago, people were really flirting with the idea of how much they wanted to talk about Booker. When I look at Towns, to me, it's an emphatic no. The numbers are awesome. The shooting for a guy that big, historic kind of stuff. He's won 3 playoff games in his entire career, and he's about to be 27 in November. And I do think the Timberwolves are going to be good. But Towns is the 7th best player. Never going to see that. Although, to be fair, when I bring up that he's only won 3 playoff games in his career, Booker had won 0 before Chris Paul showed up. But Booker feels like a better bet to be on this list potentially because he's already kind of right there. So I'm going to go ahead and put him down. I'm not going to put Towns down. Jokic is there. Embiid is there. Embiid's 24th in games played in his draft class. Again, we know that he sat the first 2 years, barely played in third. Giannis is already at the top of the list. And then in 12, you had 2 players from that draft class that actually have been in this group. Certainly Anthony Davis, that first Pelicans-Portland series where you're like, wait, is this guy a top 5 player? The bubble title, that guy was a top 5 player in the NBA. It feels weird that I'm putting somebody that's already been in that group back on the list potentially because I'm not writing him off. Although it just feels like a worse and worse bet. Lillard probably is in that Booker range with the height of his deal, like some of the playoff shot against Oklahoma City and how we rush to go, wait, is Lillard, Lillard's sitting there being like, I don't get any love. And like, how come people don't think he's a better point guard? It's because the rest of the point guards in the West are fucking awesome. So yeah, back to the Lamar thing, back to, when we talked about Trae Young just moments ago, when Lillard was the third best point guard in the West, that actually wasn't some massive insult. It can be packaged as disrespect. We can pretend that. We can go on TV shows and say, oh, how come we're not talking about Lillard a little more? Well, we're talking about Lillard the perfect amount in relation to the other players that are actually better than him. But I did feel like Lillard in the Houston series, the OKC series, like so just some of the shit that he was doing during peak Lillard years, he was probably floating in that Booker range that Booker has been in the last couple of years. Okay, so I also need to point this out. Sometimes we can't see what we can't see. We have two, maybe three of the best developmental stories we've ever seen in NBA history, and it happened kind of at the same time. Giannis becoming this, who, if you first watched it, it was exciting. It was almost a tease, though, at times. There were good video clips, but you weren't ever sure, like, is Giannis actually going to figure this thing out? And I think the first signs of it were in his third year, but it wasn't really until his fourth year, you're like, holy shit, like, this guy's going to be awesome. He is one of the great developmental stories in NBA history, maybe the greatest, because it feels like he's the best player in the world. And that's not usually where we get our best players in the world from. Usually it's pretty clear. Usually it's like, no, that's going to be a guy. Kobe was a little different because we weren't accustomed, or we didn't have any wings that were coming out of high school. So that was a little different, at least his model coming in. And we still were a little anti-high school in the 90s and all that shit that was going on. But for Giannis to become who he's been, I don't know that we saw that. Hell, when the Bucks drafted him, they didn't expect this. They've admitted that. And the other developmental story that's incredible is Kawhi, because it wasn't really until his fifth year. We're talking about a role player coming in to kind of give you a defensive matchup and maybe hit a shot or two. Paul George would be the third one. But Paul George is interesting because at one point he was on this list. During those Pacers runs, Paul George was like, wait, is this guy actually with a two-way and the shooting and the handle and the size? Like, is he the second best player behind LeBron in the East? Is he the second best player in the league? Again, you can act like that's crazy. As somebody who did the radio show every single day, we'd at least toss these things around, even if the answer wasn't yes. But the point that we were even talking about it was the actual point. George is not on that list anymore. So there very well could be a player right now that's sitting in front of all of us. And I try to do it. It's just so hard. Like, who's that player that's not scoring a ton, that was drafted a little bit later than other guys, that you go, hey, you know what? That guy could be the best player in an NBA title team and one of the clear 6 to 7 best players in the NBA. That's a hard thing to figure out. And maybe I'm not good enough at knowing who that is right now, but that's kind of the point, is I don't think many people would be. So if we look at Giannis, who's staying, Luka, who's staying, Jokic is staying, Embiid is staying, that's 4. KD, I still think is going to be really good for a couple years. But if we're talking about in 2024, Steph probably starts to slow down at that point. LeBron, I would imagine, heading into a 40-year-old season. How many people can replace the 3? Edwards, Zion, Ja. I mean, Ja's right there right now. Tatum right there right now. I'm going to say no to Mitchell. I'm going to say no to Ingram, no to Siakam, no to Murray. We'll put Booker down. No to Towns. Jokic and Embiid, as we already admitted. I don't think AD gets back into there. So I guess that's the list. Edwards, Zion, Ja, Tatum, Booker. And I'm definitely missing a couple people because we'll all be surprised.